They destroyed the black surgeon's career at 9 a.m. By noon, she was the only reason the chairman's wife was still alive. In front of the hospital board, Dr. Maya Johnson was accused by the white chief surgeon of stealing a life-saving heart transplant protocol. Her Harvard future vanished in seconds. But when the donor heart failed during a real emergency, the same protocol they mocked became the hospital's last hope, and the man who framed her was forced to watch her save the woman who could expose him. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The cold morning at St. Victoria, Boston wore winter like a sentence. Before dawn, the city existed in shades of silver and blue, its brownstone streets glazed with white frost, the Charles River hidden beneath a thin veil of mist. Streetlights reflected across frozen sidewalks while the distant sound of an ambulance cut through the quiet like a warning. The cold was the kind that slipped through coats, through skin, through memory. At 5:12 a.m., Dr. Maya Johnson stepped through the glass doors of St. Victoria Medical Center. At 27, Maya carried the rare kind of presence people noticed even when she said nothing. She was tall and graceful, with the lean, steady posture of someone who had trained herself never to show exhaustion. Her deep brown skin glowed softly beneath the fluorescent hospital lights, and her intelligent dark eyes held the kind of calm that came from surviving fear too many times to count. Her long black curls rested beneath the surgical head wrap she always wore, a dark navy cloth marked with the silver insignia of the cardiothoracic unit. It was more than habit. It was memory. Her late grandmother, Evelyn Johnson, had once worked as a nurse aide in a small public hospital in Roxbury. A short, warm woman with soft gray curls, wrinkled hands, and a voice that could quiet panic, Evelyn had raised Maya on stories of patients who survived not because of money, but because someone refused to stop trying. Before she died, she gave Maya the first version of that rap and said, "Healing hands remember what the world forgets." Maya had never entered an operating room without honoring that promise. As always, she was first. The cardiothoracic wing was nearly silent, the overhead lights still dimmed to night settings. Monitors hummed, ventilators whispered. Somewhere down the corridor, a nurse's shoes tapped softly against polished floors. Maya moved through it all with practiced familiarity. Her gloved fingers scrolled across the transplant logistics dashboard projected on the secure wall monitor. Donor transport windows, thermal stability rates, organ perfusion thresholds. Every number aligned with the simulation she had stayed up refining until nearly midnight. Then she saw it again. The result. 18 additional viable minutes. She stared at the number in silence. To most of the hospital, it would become another research metric. Another line in a paper. Another conference slide for senior surgeons. But to Maya, 18 minutes had weight. 18 minutes had a face. Because when she was 13, her mother had needed emergency cardiac intervention after collapsing on a city bus in Dorchester. The ambulance had arrived late. The specialist had been in another hospital. The transfer window had closed. They had been 18 minutes too late. That was the day Maya stopped believing medicine should belong only to the privileged. A soft voice behind her broke the silence. "Dr. Johnson, you really came in before the snowplows again." She turned. Standing near the supply cart was Dr. Ethan Brooks, 29, one of the younger surgical residents in the program. Ethan was tall, slightly broad-shouldered, with fair skin, thoughtful hazel eyes, and chestnut brown hair that always looked one hand comb away from disorder. He carried the slightly exhausted appearance of someone who cared too much to sleep properly. Unlike many of the other residents, there was no arrogance in him, only quiet attentiveness. The first day Ethan had met Maya, he had nearly frozen during a trauma intake when a patient coded unexpectedly. Maya had stepped in, guided his hands, stabilized the line, and later told him privately, "Panic is natural. Staying there is a choice." He had never forgotten it. Since then, his respect for her had bordered on loyalty. Maya gave him a tired smile. The roads were clear enough at 4. Ethan stepped closer, eyes moving to the simulation board. When he saw the result, his expression sharpened. "Wait, this is real." Maya nodded. "I reran the preservation-degradation model 6 times. If we alter the thermal cycling intervals during transport and stabilize perfusion earlier, we can safely extend viability." He looked back at the glowing number. 18 minutes, he whispered. In a transplant unit, that number was almost mythic. It could mean the difference between a helicopter making it through a snowstorm, the difference between consent paperwork finishing in time, the difference between a family hearing we lost them, and they made it. Ethan looked at her with something close to awe. This could change national transplant protocol. Maya's expression softened, but only for a moment. It could save people who don't have the luxury of perfect timing. That answer told Ethan everything he needed to know. This had never been about prestige. It had always been personal. Several floors away, in a modest apartment in South Boston, Angela Johnson stirred beneath a wool blanket as the pale gray morning light touched the window. Angela, 56, was a woman whose face carried both strength and survival. Her caramel-brown skin had softened with age, fine lines tracing the corners of eyes that had cried in private more often than they ever had in public. She was medium height, slender from years of factory work and sacrifice, with short, natural curls streaked with silver. Even in recovery, there was dignity in the way she moved. Beside her bed sat an aging portable cardiac monitor Maya had bought secondhand and repaired herself. Its green rhythm line pulsed steadily. Angela reached out and touched the framed photo beside it. Maya at medical school graduation. Cap tilted. Smile bright. Eyes determined. Angela whispered to the empty room, "You're closer than you think, baby." Back at St. Victoria, the corridor outside the cardiothoracic research lab darkened as another figure appeared behind the glass partition. Dr. Richard Whitmore. At 55, Whitmore was the kind of surgeon hospital magazines loved to feature. Tall, sharply dressed even at dawn, silver-gray hair combed flawlessly back, pale skin untouched by warmth, and piercing steel-blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of usefulness. His reputation in Boston was legendary: brilliant hands, impossible standards, and an ego that had calcified over decades of praise. He believed discipline created excellence. He also believed institutions remained strong only when the right people led them. And in the quiet corners of his mind, Maya Johnson did not fit the image of what legacy looked like. He stood outside the glass, watching her explain the data to Ethan. His expression did not change, but something colder than the weather settled in his gaze. Ethan noticed him first, his posture stiffened. "Whitmore's here." Maya turned. Their eyes met through the glass wall. Whitmore gave a small, unreadable nod before stepping inside. His voice was smooth, clinical. "You're here early, Dr. Johnson." Maya held his gaze. There was progress in the preservation model. He approached the screen, hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he studied the numbers without speaking. Ethan waited. Maya waited. Finally, Whitmore said, "Interesting." Just one word. No praise, no curiosity, no acknowledgement of the breakthrough sitting in front of him. But Maya had worked under him long enough to understand what silence meant. He was threatened. Whitmore turned slightly toward Ethan. "Morning rounds begin in 20. Don't let research fantasies interfere with surgical discipline." Ethan lowered his eyes. "Yes, sir." Then Whitmore looked back at Maya. A faint smile touched his lips, but there was no warmth in it. "Be careful what you bring into the boardroom, Dr. Johnson. Big ideas tend to attract scrutiny." Then he left. The corridor felt colder after he was gone. Ethan exhaled slowly. He knows this matters. Maya looked once more at the glowing 18-minute result. Outside, Boston's frozen skyline slowly brightened with the first hints of sunrise. Inside St. Victoria, something else was beginning to rise. Not recognition, not yet. Pressure, attention, danger. Maya saved the final simulation under her encrypted personal research credentials and closed the dashboard. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself a single private thought. This is the moment everything changes. And somewhere beyond the frosted hospital windows, the city kept breathing, unaware that before the day was over, 18 minutes would become the most dangerous number inside St. Victoria Medical Center. The accusation in the boardroom. By 8:30, the winter light over Boston had sharpened into a pale gray glare against the upper windows of St. Victoria Medical Center, turning the executive floor into a chamber of cold reflections. The city outside remained frozen and distant, but inside the hospital's boardroom, the air carried a different kind of chill. One built from money, reputation, and the quiet violence of judgment. The room was already full when Dr. Maya Johnson stepped in, a long, polished walnut table stretched beneath hanging lights, its glossy surface reflecting crystal water glasses, leather folders, and the faces of people who held futures in their hands. Hospital executives sat on one side, their expressions professionally neutral. Across from them were major donors, some old Boston families whose names adorned wings, scholarships, and marble plaques throughout the building. At the far end sat two representatives from Harvard's Cardiothoracic Residency Selection Committee, their presence alone enough to tighten every muscle in Maya's shoulders. Maya carried her tablet close to her chest, posture straight, expression calm. Her navy suit was simple but precise, worn over a white blouse, her symbolic surgical head wrap still in place beneath the formal setting. She had debated removing it for the meeting, then decided against it. The cloth represented memory, duty, and every reason she had stayed in medicine when easier paths had been offered. This room would see who she truly was. Standing near the presentation console was Samuel Bennett, the chairman of St. Victoria. At 62, Bennett had the polished appearance of a man shaped by boardrooms rather than hospital corridors. Silver hair, warm but tired brown eyes, and the measured patience of someone who had spent years balancing medicine against donor influence. Though outwardly calm, the strain in his face hinted at recent pressure. Fundraising numbers had been weak. A new transplant expansion project was stalled. One public scandal could threaten millions. He gave Maya a brief nod. "Dr. Johnson, the floor is yours." Maya inhaled once, then activated the wall display. A 3D preservation model unfolded across the screen. Donor transport intervals, perfusion temperature curves, oxygen stabilization, and decay delay projections. The centerpiece glowed in bold blue. Plus 18 minutes viable extension. Her voice was steady. "If we adjust the thermal cycling window during transit and initiate perfusion stabilization earlier, we can safely increase donor heart viability by 18 minutes without raising ischemic injury risk." The room was silent, but not hostile. Not yet. Several executives leaned forward. One of the Harvard physicians, Dr. Laura Chen, a sharp-featured woman in her late 40s with black hair tied into a precise knot and observant dark eyes, began taking notes. Dr. Chen had built her reputation on spotting surgical innovators early, and her attention alone sent a flicker of hope through Maya. Then the interruption came. "Stop." The word cut through the room with surgical precision. Dr. Richard Whitmore rose slowly from his seat. His silver-gray hair was immaculate, his tailored charcoal suit flawless, his expression unreadable except for the cold certainty in his eyes. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority in St. Victoria had long ago become part of the architecture. Whitmore stepped toward the screen. "This protocol," he said, voice smooth as ice, "belongs to the hospital's restricted transplant archives." Silence, the kind that arrives before impact. Maya blinked once, almost certain she had misheard. Whitmore turned toward the board, then toward the Harvard representatives. "This preservation sequence mirrors confidential research material accessible only through sealed administrative channels." The words landed like a verdict. A donor near the middle of the table shifted in his chair. Another executive's expression hardened. Maya found her voice. "That's not true." But Whitmore was already moving. He pressed a command into the side console. The display behind Maya changed. Her simulation vanished. In its place appeared internal access timestamps, hospital system logs showing repeated late-night entries into restricted transplant research folders. Beside each entry was her staff credential ID. The room changed instantly. The same people who had leaned in with interest now leaned back with suspicion. Dr. Laura Chen's pen stopped moving. Then, quietly, without expression, she closed the Harvard residency folder in front of her. Maya felt it like the sound of a locked door. Her future disappeared in real time. "I never accessed those files," Maya said more firmly now. Whitmore folded his hands behind his back, almost serene. "The system says otherwise." His calmness was worse than anger. It felt rehearsed, polished, inevitable, as if this moment had been prepared long before she entered the room. At the side of the room, Ethan Brooks stood near the secondary display monitors, officially present only to assist with technical visuals. But his hazel eyes narrowed the moment the logs appeared. Something was wrong. The timestamps were too perfect. The access intervals were evenly spaced, almost mechanical. No pauses, no variants, no pattern of human navigation through complex research folders. It looked less like browsing and more like a planted sequence. He kept his expression neutral, but his pulse quickened. At the back of the boardroom stood Monica Hayes, the senior surgical nurse supervisor. Monica was 61, tall and composed, with warm brown skin, short silver curls, and the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years inside operating rooms. Her face carried the stillness of experience. Crises no longer startled her, but injustice still did. Months ago, during a double transplant overnight, Monica had walked past the research lab and seen Maya alone at 2 a.m., still in scrubs, sketching perfusion intervals on the glass board. She remembered because Maya had missed dinner, rounds, and sleep that night. This idea had existed long before any so-called restricted file. Monica's eyes moved from the false-looking timestamps to Whitmore's expression. A shadow of concern crossed her face. Seated beside the donor representatives was Charles Everett, one of the hospital's largest private sponsors. Everett, 58, was a narrow-faced venture capitalist with pale skin, sharp green eyes, and the kind of expensive stillness that came from lifelong privilege. He had recently pledged funding for the Transplant Expansion Center, but only if leadership remained stable. Scandal, to men like him, was leverage. He leaned toward Chairman Bennett and spoke in a low voice that still carried enough for the nearby table to hear. "A Harvard-linked plagiarism scandal could delay our expansion indefinitely." The implication was obvious. Bennett's jaw tightened. Money was now sitting in the room beside morality. Maya forced herself not to look shaken. "I developed this model over the last 7 months," she said. "The base equations came from independent simulation work under my personal research credentials." Whitmore gave the faintest smile. "Then you should have no problem explaining why the hospital archive reflects otherwise." Every eye in the room turned back to the screen. Maya stared at the timestamps, each one using her ID, each one arranged like a noose. For the first time that morning, doubt moved through the board. Not doubt in Whitmore. Doubt in her. The shift was visible in posture, in silence, in the way people stopped seeing her as a surgeon and began seeing her as a risk. Dr. Laura Chen finally spoke, voice controlled and formal. "Until the integrity of this research can be verified, Harvard will suspend consideration of Dr. Johnson's residency file." The words were devastating precisely because they were so polite. Suspended. A clean institutional word for collapse. Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of the podium. Whitmore said nothing. He simply returned to his seat with the calm satisfaction of a man watching a procedure go exactly as planned. Ethan lowered his gaze to the auxiliary terminal beside him. He quietly copied the visible log string into a private note. There was one anomaly he couldn't ignore. The administrator access signature embedded in the metadata had been scrubbed, but not completely. A ghost fragment remained. Not enough to prove anything. Not yet. But enough to tell him this was no ordinary accusation. Across the room, Monica met Maya's eyes for the briefest moment. It was not reassurance. It was recognition. She remembered those nights. She remembered the research existing long before this room decided it didn't. Chairman Bennett finally cleared his throat. This matter will be reviewed internally. Until then, this board suspends public consideration of the preservation proposal. No applause, no questions, no defense, only the cold machinery of institutional retreat. Maya stood frozen for one heartbeat longer, then slowly gathered her tablet. The breakthrough that could save lives had been transformed into evidence against her. As she turned toward the boardroom doors, the frosted skyline of Boston reflected faintly across the glass wall behind the executives. The city outside kept moving. Inside, the first real fracture in Maya Johnson's future had just been made. And in the silence left behind, Ethan knew only one thing for certain. The logs were lying. The apartment, the monitor, the promise. That night, South Boston disappeared beneath snow. The storm had thickened by the time Dr. Maya Johnson climbed the narrow steps to her apartment building, the wind driving frozen pellets against the brick walls hard enough to sound like thrown gravel. The city that had looked so sharp and clinical from the hospital windows now felt older here. Street lamps flickering over buried sidewalks, parked cars swallowed by white drifts, the harbor wind pressing cold into every crack of the neighborhood. By the time Maya unlocked her apartment door, exhaustion had settled into her bones like weight. The heater was already rattling. It always made the same tired metallic sound whenever the temperature dropped too fast, as if the old machine resented every Boston winter it had survived. The apartment itself was small but warm in the ways that mattered. Books stacked beside the sofa, medical journals spread across the kitchen table, an old framed graduation photo on the wall, and the faint scent of ginger tea Angela always brewed before bed. Maya quietly set her bag down. Across the room, beside the window, Angela Johnson slept beneath a thick, knitted blanket, the pale green glow of an aging, portable cardiac monitor washing soft light across her face. At 56, Angela carried the quiet endurance of a woman who had spent most of her life giving more than she had. Her caramel-brown skin had softened with time, silver strands threading through her short, natural curls, and even in sleep there was something strong in the set of her jaw. Years of factory shifts, bus rides before sunrise, and choosing bills over comfort had shaped the calm resilience in her. She had once been known in her neighborhood for never asking anyone for help, even after Maya's father died when Maya was 10. Pride in Angela had always come from survival. The monitor beside her bed was old enough to hum between rhythm updates. Maya had rebuilt part of its circuitry herself using second-hand parts from a medical resale store near Cambridge. She sat beside it now, staring at the green waveform rise and fall. Steady, steady, alive. For a long time she said nothing. The humiliation of the boardroom replayed in fragments. Whitmore's voice, the false timestamps, Harvard's folder closing, the donors turning away as if suspicion itself were contagious. She had spent years believing excellence could protect her. That skill would speak louder than politics. Tonight proved otherwise. Her mother stirred. Angela's eyes opened slowly, warm brown and still sharp despite the fatigue that often followed her cardiac episodes. "Maya?" Maya forced a small smile. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." Angela studied her daughter's face for only a moment before understanding settled in. She had always been able to read Maya faster than anyone else. It happened today. Not a question. Maya lowered her eyes. "He accused me in front of everyone. Said I stole it." Angela was silent for a beat, then slowly pushed herself upright against the pillows. Even recovering from heart weakness, she still carried the natural dignity of someone impossible to diminish. "Tell me everything." And Maya did. The boardroom. Whitmore. The timestamps. Harvard suspending her file. The way even silence in that room had felt like judgment. When she finished, the storm outside seemed louder. Angela looked toward the old monitor for a moment, listening to its soft pulse. Then she said quietly, "Do you remember the winter on Dorchester Avenue?" Maya's chest tightened. Of course she remembered. She had been 13. Angela had collapsed after weeks of ignoring chest pain because the rent had gone up, and she refused to miss another shift at the textile plant. The emergency room doctor had explained they needed to transfer her for specialized cardiac intervention, but the transport took too long. Insurance approvals stalled, and the surgical window narrowed with every passing minute. They had missed it. Not by hours. By 18 minutes. Angela's hand moved gently over Maya's. That night, when they said they were too late, you stood outside the ICU and told me one day you'd become the doctor who gives people back the minutes they lose. Maya swallowed hard. The memory hit with startling clarity. The smell of antiseptic, the hiss of oxygen, the helpless rage of watching money and timing decide who lived well. Angela squeezed her hand. You didn't come this far to beg men like him. The words landed deeper than comfort. They carried history, legacy, instruction. Something inside Maya shifted. Not hope. Something stronger. Resolve. At nearly the same hour, several floors below the main surgical server wing at St. Victoria, Dr. Ethan Brooks sat alone in the dim light of the hospital IT access room. The space was cramped, filled with humming drives, blinking status lights and the low, static hum of cooling fans. Ethan's white coat was gone, replaced by rolled-up sleeves and the tired concentration in his hazel eyes. He had spent the last 3 hours quietly tracing the metadata chain from the boardroom logs. Something was buried there. The visible timestamps still looked artificially clean, but deeper inside the mirrored backup tree he found what he had hoped for. An older server snapshot scheduled before dawn. Hospital systems automatically created one every 12 hours. If the visible logs had been altered, the snapshot might preserve the untouched version. He inserted an encrypted external drive. The progress bar began copying. Backup secured. It still wasn't proof, but it was a beginning. As he removed the drive, the door opened softly behind him. Monica Hayes stepped inside. The senior nurse supervisor's silver curls caught the sterile light as she folded her arms, expression calm but knowing. Monica had spent 4 decades in operating rooms, enough time to recognize the difference between nervousness and purpose. You're doing this for Maya. Again, not a question. Ethan nodded. The logs were wrong. Too smooth, too perfect. Monica's face hardened slightly. I saw her working that protocol months ago. Overnight double shift. She missed dinner and nearly missed morning rounds because she was still testing perfusion timing on the glass board. Her voice carried certainty, born from memory. She built that sequence herself. Ethan looked at the copied drive in his hand. If this backup holds original access signatures, we may be able to prove it. Monica stepped closer, lowering her voice. If the board needs someone to testify to what I saw, I will. There was no hesitation in her tone, only conviction. It mattered because Monica Hayes was not known for speculation. In St. Victoria, her word inside an operating room carried the weight of policy. By morning, the storm had weakened into fine, drifting snow. Boston's streets looked pale and half-buried as Maya stepped back through the doors of St. Victoria Medical Center. Her posture straighter than it had been the day before. Word of the scandal had already spread. Nurses at the desk fell silent when she passed. 2 junior residents paused mid-conversation. A transport orderly looked up from his coffee with open curiosity. The hospital buzzed with the disbelief that only follows public humiliation. Most expected Maya Johnson to come in prepared to defend herself, to explain, to plead. Instead, she walked directly to the executive offices. Chairman Samuel Bennett was just leaving a donor briefing when she met him outside the glass conference suite. He looked tired, the pressure of donors and scandal already carving deeper lines into his face. Dr. Johnson, he said carefully. Maya held his gaze. I'm not here to apologize. Bennett's brow lifted. I'm requesting a live emergency transplant simulation before the full board. For the first time since the accusation, genuine surprise crossed his face. Behind him, a junior administrator nearly dropped her tablet. The hallway itself seemed to still. A live simulation in front of donors, executives, and Harvard observers was unheard of at this level. It was not defense. It was challenge. From farther down the corridor, Dr. Richard Whitmore emerged from the cardiothoracic wing, having caught enough of the exchange to understand what she had just asked. His pale face remained unreadable. Then, slowly, a smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He believed pressure would finally break her. He believed public failure would finish what the accusation had started. But as Maya stood in the center of the executive corridor, snow light reflecting faintly through the windows behind her, the promise made beside an old heart monitor the night before remained steady inside her. She would not beg. She would make them watch. And by the time the news of her demand spread through St. Victoria, the entire hospital had begun to hum with a new kind of tension. Not scandal. Expectation. The public trial in the operating theater. By late morning, the snow outside St. Victoria Medical Center had softened into a pale white haze over Boston. But inside the hospital, tension had hardened into something almost ceremonial. Every corridor near the cardiothoracic wing buzzed with whispers. Nurses slowed near open doors. Residents pretended to review charts while watching the digital schedule boards. The entire building seemed to understand that what was about to happen was no longer a routine evaluation. It was a trial. The central operating theater had been transformed into a public evaluation chamber. Tiered observation glass overlooked the sterile surgical floor below, while a bank of ceiling cameras projected every angle to the executive conference hall upstairs, where the board, donors, and Harvard representatives waited behind a live surgical feed. The usual atmosphere of focused medical precision had been replaced by something colder, scrutiny wrapped in protocol. At the center of the room stood Dr. Maya Johnson, dressed in dark blue scrubs beneath her sterile gown, her symbolic surgical head wrap secured tightly beneath her cap. Her posture was steady, shoulders relaxed, eyes alert. If she felt the weight of the room, she refused to let it reach her hands. Across from her, Dr. Richard Whitmore stood with folded arms. His tall frame remained perfectly still, silver-gray hair neat beneath a surgical cap, pale eyes fixed on Maya with the detached confidence of a man convinced he had already won. To everyone watching, he projected calm authority, but beneath it was something sharper. Anticipation. He believed this room, this pressure, and the impossible scenario ahead would finish what the accusation began. On the main digital board, the sealed case file was finally unlocked. The simulation parameters appeared one line at a time. Delayed donor heart arrival, rare vascular mismatch, oxygenation window collapsing, a near-impossible transplant chain. Several observers in the upper glass gallery exchanged looks. Even among experienced surgeons, it was the kind of case that destroyed confidence. Maya stepped toward the digital board without hesitation. Her gloved hand moved across the interface, rotating the 3D vascular model as she began reconstructing the preservation timeline from transport delay to extracorporeal bypass entry. If the ischemic interval exceeds the projected threshold, she said calmly, voice carrying through the speakers into the conference hall, the perfusion sequence must compensate before vascular integration begins. Her explanation was precise, clear, almost classroom-like. Upstairs, Dr. Laura Chen reopened her Harvard folder. Not fully, just enough to listen. In the rear equipment bay, Dr. Ethan Brooks stood near the systems console officially assigned to monitor simulation feeds and archive playback data. But his real attention remained on the metadata trace he had continued analyzing from the backup snapshot. The ghost fragment from the boardroom logs had finally resolved. His breath caught. The final privilege modification signature came from a system administrator pathway routed through Whitmore's executive research credentials. It still needed deeper validation, but it was enough to confirm what Ethan had feared. The logs had not only been altered, they had been altered using Whitmore's own authority level. He quickly encrypted the evidence fragment into the backup drive and slipped it into the inner pocket of his scrub jacket. Not enough for the board. Not yet. But enough to know Maya had been telling the truth. In the operating theater's prep corridor, Monica Hayes moved like controlled gravity. The senior nurse supervisor had personally assembled the support team for the simulation. 3 nurses, 2 perfusion techs, and a transport specialist, each chosen less for rank than for trust. Monica's calm authority steadied the room. Her short silver curls were hidden beneath her cap, but her warm brown eyes missed nothing. She paused beside Maya just long enough to say quietly, "The people in this room who matter are with you." It was not encouragement, it was confirmation. Maya gave the smallest nod and returned to the digital anatomy display. Upstairs, Samuel Bennett sat in the conference hall with the board and donors, his expression unreadable but tight. Beside him, sponsor Charles Everett watched the surgical feed with predatory stillness, clearly waiting to see whether the scandal would worsen or disappear. Bennett barely heard the simulation commentary. His thoughts had been split all morning between hospital reputation, donor pressure, and the reality that this public event could either restore confidence or collapse the transplant expansion entirely. Then, every screen in the hospital flashed red. The alert tone shattered the chamber. 1 pulse, 2. Then continuous emergency alarm. Every monitor in the operating theater, the conference hall, and the outer corridors switched from simulation feed to code crimson cardiac priority. For half a second, no one moved. Then the text appeared. Eleanor Bennett, acute myocardial infarction, emergency department level 1. Samuel Bennett's face drained of color. His wife. The chairman rose so abruptly his chair nearly tipped backward. A stunned silence hit the conference room before chaos replaced it. Assistants rushed toward phones. Executives stood. Donors turned to one another in alarm. Down in the operating theater, even Whitmore's composure cracked. Maya looked up at the monitor feed as the emergency overlay continued updating. Then the second disaster arrived. A trauma transport coordinator burst through the side doors. Lena Morales, 34, was one of the hospital's fastest emergency logistics officers. Short, athletic, olive-toned skin, black hair tied into a severe bun, and a voice trained by years of ambulance bay triage to cut through panic. She was breathing hard. The donor heart transport unit from Worcester just reported a preservation systems malfunction. She said thermal cycling failure, backup coolant instability. The room went still. The simulation was no longer theoretical. A real donor heart. A real collapse in viability. A real patient whose survival window was shrinking by the second. Upstairs, Samuel Bennett pressed one hand against the conference table, visibly shaken. The crisis had instantly transformed from institutional scandal into personal catastrophe. His wife's life and the hospital's reputation had collided. Charles Everett leaned toward him, voice low and sharp. "If the hospital fails your wife on live feed day, donors will panic." The cruelty of the statement barely registered. Bennett's eyes were fixed on the red emergency screen. For the first time in years, the chairman of St. Victoria was not thinking like an executive. He was thinking like a husband. In the operating theater, Whitmore stepped toward the emergency panel. "We need to transfer the case to Senior Transplant Authority immediately." But the transport data continued updating. Delay length, coolant variance, vascular mismatch. It was almost identical to the sealed simulation case. The room collectively understood the impossible truth. The challenge Maya had been solving for the board was now unfolding in real life. Monica moved first. Her voice rang through the prep corridor. "Team Alpha, Prep Or 1 for live intake. Full bypass support. Perfusion standby." The nurses she had chosen responded instantly, not because protocol demanded it, because they trusted her judgment. Because she trusted Maya. Whitmore turned sharply toward Bennett's live feed monitor upstairs. "Chairman, this requires senior authority." Samuel Bennett stared down at the surgical floor, then at Maya. She stood in the center of the room, calm amid the rising storm, her gloved hands still resting beside the simulation model that had become reality. The irony was brutal. The woman they had publicly accused of theft was now the only person already working through the exact scenario threatening his wife's life. Maya stepped closer to the main surgical board. Her dark eyes moved across the live transport metrics, then to the vascular mismatch display, then to the oxygenation countdown. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm enough to silence the room. "This isn't a simulation anymore." No one answered. No one needed to. Every camera remained live. Every donor, every executive, every Harvard observer, every resident in the hospital was now watching the same thing. Not a boardroom scandal. A life-or-death test unfolding in real time. The operating theater had become the public courtroom Whitmore wanted. Only now the verdict would be written in a heartbeat. And as the donor heart countdown clock continued dropping toward critical loss, the entire hospital seemed to hold its breath around one terrifying truth. Maya Johnson had been preparing for this exact moment all along. The 18 minutes. This was the moment. The emergency countdown glowed in red across every screen in OHR 1, each second bleeding into the next as the donor heart preservation window narrowed toward failure. The operating theater that had been transformed into a public trial now stood suspended in a silence so sharp it felt surgical. The board still watched through the live feed upstairs. Harvard observers remained fixed to the monitors. Every surgeon, resident, and nurse in the hospital knew what was happening, but inside the room itself, no one moved. Not at first. The live transport metrics continued to flash warnings. Coolant instability, oxygenation collapse risk, delayed vascular viability. The chairman's wife, Eleanor Bennett, had already been wheeled into the adjacent prep bay, sedated and rapidly declining. At 58, Eleanor was known throughout St. Victoria not for wealth, but for grace. Tall and slender, with silver blonde hair and kind gray eyes that staff often remembered, because she always learned their names. She had spent years quietly funding cardiac recovery programs for low-income women. The cruel irony of her now lying at the edge of a failed donor heart window was not lost on anyone. Still, none of the senior surgeons stepped forward. Responsibility in a failed transplant could end careers. The silence stretched. Then Dr. Maya Johnson moved. She stepped into the center of the operating floor with a calmness so complete it forced the room to reorganize itself around her. Beneath the sterile lights, her dark eyes sharpened on the preservation display, then on the extracorporeal circulation console, then on the donor transport metrics streaming in real time. Her voice cut through the paralysis. Perfusion chain reroute. Shift thermal stabilization to pre-bypass phase. Increase coolant compensation by 0.6 and bring the oxygenation threshold forward. Every instruction came sharp, calm, absolute. The room obeyed almost before anyone consciously decided to. At the bypass station stood Noah Patel, the lead perfusionist assigned to emergency transplant support. Noah, 41, was medium height with olive-brown skin, rectangular glasses, and the steady, disciplined demeanor of someone who trusted numbers more than people. Years earlier, he had lost a teenage patient during a transport delay because a senior surgeon had hesitated too long to alter protocol. Since then, Noah respected only one thing in crisis: decisiveness. He looked up at Maya. For one beat, he hesitated, not from doubt, but from the sheer audacity of what she was ordering. Then he nodded. "Rerouting now." The extracorporeal circulation chain shifted under her redesign. Instead of allowing the donor heart to continue degrading under the damaged transport preservation model, Maya redirected perfusion flow into an accelerated stabilization sequence built from the exact 18-minute extension protocol she had developed. What had once been theory now became living surgery. Across the room, one of Whitmore's senior attending surgeons, Dr. Paul Mercer, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with thinning blonde hair and the brittle confidence of institutional hierarchy, stepped forward with visible resistance. "This isn't approved transplant sequence." Maya did not even look at him. "It is now if you want her alive." The monitors answered before Mercer could. Oxygenation values began climbing. Slowly at first, then unmistakably. The room changed. Doubt became focus. One by one, the senior surgeons who had frozen moments earlier began moving into position under Maya's direction. Clamp support, vascular prep, perfusion adjustment. hypothermic stabilization. Even those who disliked her authority could not argue with the numbers. Upstairs in the conference hall, Samuel Bennett stood frozen beside the live screen, his hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The executive calm he had worn for years had been stripped away, leaving only a husband watching the line between life and loss. Beside him, donor Charles Everett had gone silent. For the first time that day, money had no language for what was happening. Far below the OR level, Dr. Ethan Brooks sprinted through the IT corridor toward the secure server room. The encrypted backup drive in his pocket contained enough to suggest Whitmore's involvement, but not enough to survive formal board scrutiny. What he needed now was the root mirror snapshot, the untouched original archive stored in the hospital's cold redundancy server. The problem was access. The cold server required physical retrieval authorization. As Ethan pushed through the reinforced server door, he nearly collided with Rosa Martinez, the Night Systems archivist finishing an overtime double shift. Rosa, 50, short and sharp-eyed with dark curls streaked in gray, had spent 20 years protecting St. Victoria's digital infrastructure with the same seriousness Monica brought to the OR. Her son had once survived emergency surgery at this very hospital, and since then she treated every bite of patient truth like sacred record. "You shouldn't be in here," she said. Ethan didn't slow. "I need the root mirror from yesterday's archive chain. Now!" She looked at the panic in his face, then at the live emergency alert pulsing on the wall monitor. Without another question, she keyed open the cold storage rack. The untouched snapshot began exporting. Back upstairs, surgery had become war. Hours seemed to compress into breaths. Maya stood at the center of it all, directing the flow of people, machines, and time itself. Her hands moved between displays, bypass controls and vascular models with astonishing clarity. She adjusted the thermal compensation sequence twice, rerouted perfusion once more to offset transport tissue stress, and recalculated the oxygenation collapse curve in real time. Each change bought seconds, then minutes, then the impossible. Across town, in the small South Boston apartment, Angela Johnson sat upright in bed with Ethan's tablet balanced on her lap. He had sent her a secure internal live stream link minutes earlier with only one message: "She's doing it. Watch." The aging heart monitor beside Angela hummed softly as she stared at the screen, tears already gathering. On the tablet, Maya stood under the OR lights exactly the way Angela had once imagined when her daughter was only 13 and standing outside an ICU, furious at the world for stealing time from the poor. Now, her daughter was stealing time back. Angela pressed trembling fingers to her lips as the perfusion values rose. Back in OR1, the tension shifted again. The donor heart was integrated. The vascular mismatch had been corrected through Maya's revised sequence. All that remained was the moment no one could guarantee: restart. Even Dr. Richard Whitmore, who had spent the day weaponizing public scrutiny, now stood near the secondary surgical monitor with a face drained of certainty. Beneath the cap, his pale skin looked almost gray. For the first time, real fear moved through him. Not fear for Eleanor Bennett. Fear of what Maya's success would mean. Every improvement on the monitor stripped another layer from the accusation he had built. If she succeeded using the very protocol he called stolen, the room itself would become proof of her brilliance, and every live camera was still recording. Maya's voice lowered. "Charge sequence ready." Noah Patel nodded from the perfusion station. "Ready." The room held still. Even the overhead ventilation seemed quieter. Maya looked once at the donor heart integration display, once at Eleanor's oxygenation values, and finally at the ECG monitor. Clear. The sequence initiated. For one terrible second, the line remained flat. Then, a tremor. Small, almost uncertain. The ECG line quivered, spiked, paused, then rose again, stronger. A rhythm, once, twice, then stable. A heartbeat returned. The room froze in collective disbelief. No one spoke, no one breathed. The sound of the monitor filled the silence with the steady, miraculous cadence of survival. Upstairs, Samuel Bennett closed his eyes and lowered his head, overcome by the sound of his wife's returning life. In the apartment, Angela let out a shaking sob of relief. Inside OR 1, even the senior surgeons who had resisted Maya stood speechless beneath the reality she had just forced into existence. The 18 minutes they had doubted had become the margin between death and life. And under the bright surgical lights, with every camera still live and every witness now transformed by what they had seen, Maya Johnson remained standing at the center of the room, calm, exhausted, and undeniable, as the restored heartbeat echoed through St. Victoria like a verdict no one could challenge. The truth in the system logs. The applause inside OR 1 lasted less than 3 minutes. It began as stunned relief, the involuntary release of fear after the ECG line stabilized and Eleanor Bennett's heartbeat settled into a strong, repeatable rhythm. Nurses exhaled. One of the senior surgeons removed his glasses just to wipe the sweat from his face. Even the live feed observers upstairs, who had spent the morning watching Maya Johnson as if she were on trial, now sat in silence before the undeniable reality of what she had done. But triumph in hospitals is always fragile. Before the room could fully shift into celebration, Dr. Ethan Brooks pushed through the boardroom doors upstairs with Monica Hayes at his side and the hospital's IT director only one step behind. The atmosphere changed instantly. The boardroom, still half-lit by the surgical live feed, had become something stranger now. Part executive chamber, part courtroom, part confession booth. The frozen Boston skyline beyond the windows had darkened into a steel blue evening, and the city lights below flickered like distant signals against the snow. Ethan's chest rose and fell hard from the sprint up from cold storage. In his hand was the encrypted drive, not theory, not suspicion, proof. Beside him walked Monica Hayes, composed as ever, silver curls tucked beneath a dark wool cap now that she had left the OR floor. Her warm brown face carried no triumph, only resolve. She had spent too many years watching truth arrive late to mistake this moment for victory before it was spoken aloud. Behind them came Victor Lang, the hospital's IT director. Victor was 54, slim, pale, and meticulous, with narrow shoulders, rimless glasses, and the kind of precise manner that came from decades of building systems where every action left a trace. He was not a dramatic man. In St. Victoria, his reputation rested on one principle. The servers never lied unless someone made them. That alone made his presence devastating. Chairman Samuel Bennett, still visibly shaken from nearly losing his wife, slowly returned to his seat at the head of the conference table. "What is this?" he asked, voice low. Ethan stepped to the central display console. "This is the untouched root mirror from the hospital's cold redundancy server." He inserted the drive. The screen changed. Gone were the manipulated timestamps Whitmore had weaponized in the original accusation. Now the board saw the full archive chain, unedited, authenticated, irrefutable. The first file tree expanded. A series of protocol drafts appeared under. Maya Johnson, personal research credentials date stamps rolled down the screen. 7 months ago. 6 months, 3 weeks ago. 5 months ago, each draft showed iterative refinements of the exact 18-minute donor heart viability extension model. Thermal cycling revisions, perfusion flow redesign, bypass pre-stabilization, the same sequence Maya had just used to save Eleanor Bennett's life. The evidence was devastating. A murmur spread around the boardroom. Dr. Laura Chen reopened the Harvard folder completely this time, eyes narrowing as she reviewed the dates. Maya had not stolen this work. She had built it, piece by piece, month by month. Ethan clicked to the second data set. This time, the room went even quieter. A buried administrative override path unfolded, showing that Maya's internal submission to the Transplant Innovation Review Board had been intercepted, rerouted, suppressed. The access signature appeared in cold white text. Richard Whitmore, Executive Administrative Override. Samuel Bennett's face hardened. Whitmore, who had entered the boardroom moments earlier expecting praise for Eleanor's survival, stopped walking. For the first time all day, he looked genuinely unprepared. Victor Lang adjusted his glasses and spoke with measured precision. These override permissions were used to bury Dr. Johnson's report before scheduled board review. The same administrative pathway then copied the proposal framework into a secondary resident mentorship file. The secondary file opened. A new name appeared: Dr. Allison Pierce. From the far end of the boardroom, a young woman slowly stood. At 28, Allison Pierce looked every bit the image of institutional promise. Blonde hair in a flawless low bun, fair skin, sharp green eyes, and the controlled posture of someone trained never to betray nerves. She was one of Whitmore's favored senior residents, known for polished conference presentations and donor-facing confidence. But beneath that polished exterior, there had always been a subtle brittleness to her, the kind born from a career built too quickly under someone else's protection. Her voice trembled. "I didn't write the original protocol." The room turned toward her. Allison swallowed hard. "Dr. Whitmore told me the preservation sequence was a mentorship transfer project. He said he wanted me to present it for the Donor Expansion Initiative." Her eyes briefly found Maya's. The guilt there was immediate and real. "I should have questioned it." Whitmore finally stepped forward. "This is absurd!" But the word lacked force because the evidence was still expanding. Victor opened the final metadata branch. The false boardroom timestamps, the ones used to accuse Maya, had been generated from the same administrative route path Whitmore used to bury the real files. The architecture of the lie was complete. Maya's drafts had been hidden. The credit had been redirected toward a favored resident tied to donor politics. And when Maya moved too close to presenting it herself, the false theft narrative had been activated. Monica stepped forward then, her voice steady enough to silence even the whispers. "I saw Dr. Johnson working this protocol overnight months ago," she said. "Double-shift transplant week. She stayed in the lab until after 2 a.m., sketching thermal timing adjustments on the glass board. She looked directly at Samuel Bennett. She built this long before any of us knew it would save your wife." The words landed with a moral weight no data could replicate. Now it was no longer just code. It was witness, human memory aligned with digital truth. Ethan became the final decisive voice. He stepped away from the console and faced the board. The original logs used against Dr. Johnson were too clean. No human navigation variants. That's why I checked the cold redundancy mirror. Dr. Whitmore altered the visible access chain using executive override, but the root server preserved the original path. He paused, then added the line that shattered whatever remained of Whitmore's authority. He framed her using the hospital's own integrity systems. No one in the room defended Whitmore. Not Mercer. Not Everett. Not even the executives who had once hidden behind his reputation, because they had all just watched Maya use the so-called stolen protocol to save the chairman's wife on live feed. Every second of her success had become retrospective proof. Whitmore looked around the room, perhaps expecting loyalty from old alliances. He found none. For the first time in years, Dr. Richard Whitmore had no words. The legendary surgeon who had spent decades controlling operating rooms, careers, and reputations now stood in the exact silence he had once weaponized against Maya. Only this silence belonged to him. The same silence Maya had endured. Not confusion, judgment. Samuel Bennett slowly rose. The grief, gratitude, and fury of the day had stripped away every layer of executive diplomacy. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough to be terrifying. "You buried the work that saved my wife." Whitmore said nothing. Victor Lang removed the executive access badge from the evidence tray and placed it on the conference table like a ceremonial end. No one touched it. Across the room, Maya stood near the windows, snowlight and city glow reflecting faintly across the glass behind her. She did not smile. Vindication did not feel like triumph. It felt like the return of oxygen after being forced underwater. The boardroom that had condemned her only hours earlier now sat trapped inside the consequences of its own doubt. And in the center of that room, with the untouched logs still glowing across the display, truth no longer needed a voice. Because the system had spoken, and this time, it had spoken for her. The new operating room. Weeks later, Boston no longer looked like a city holding its breath. Spring sunlight spilled across the Charles River in long bands of gold, warming the brownstone streets that had once been buried beneath winter frost. The sidewalks outside St. Victoria Medical Center were alive again. Interns carrying coffee cups, patients stepping into the morning air, the faint sound of distant traffic mixing with birds that had finally returned to the city trees. The cold, punishing gray that had framed Maya's public humiliation was gone. In its place stood something softer, renewal. Inside the hospital auditorium, every seat was filled. Residents in white coats lined the side aisles. Nurses from the cardiothoracic wing stood shoulder to shoulder near the back. Board members, department chairs, donors, and even transport staff had gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling where St. Victoria usually held research awards and memorial lectures. Today, the atmosphere was different. Not ceremonial. Personal. At the center of the stage stood Dr. Maya Johnson. She wore a tailored navy suit with silver trim at the collar, elegant without losing the quiet discipline that defined her. Her long dark curls rested beneath a refined version of her symbolic surgical head wrap, now embroidered with the insignia of the Transplant Research Unit. At 27, she no longer looked like the isolated resident who had walked into the boardroom weeks earlier. She looked like legacy in motion. Her posture was calm, but behind the stillness lived everything the past weeks had cost her: humiliation, fear, vindication, and the unbearable moment of hearing Eleanor Bennett's heartbeat return. Now the entire hospital stood to face her. At the podium, Dr. Laura Chen adjusted the envelope in her hand. The Harvard representative's severe black suit and precise posture still carried the same intimidating professionalism Maya had first seen in the boardroom, but today her expression held something warmer. Respect earned through proof, not politics. On behalf of Harvard's cardiothoracic residency program, Dr. Chen said, voice carrying cleanly through the hall, "It is my honor to formally offer Dr. Maya Johnson an advanced residency appointment in cardiothoracic transplant innovation." For one suspended moment, the room was silent. Then the auditorium erupted. Applause thundered through the chamber. Monica Hayes was the first nurse to stand. Ethan Brooks followed immediately, clapping hard enough that the resident beside him laughed through tears. Even some of the same executives who had once doubted Maya now rose in reluctant but undeniable recognition. Maya stepped forward and accepted the Harvard folder. This time, it opened. Inside, the appointment letter gleamed beneath the stage lights. Everything Whitmore had tried to bury now existed in writing. But the greater honor came next. Chairman Samuel Bennett, visibly steadier now after weeks spent dividing his time between the hospital and Eleanor's recovery suite, approached the microphone. The strain that had once defined his face had softened into gratitude. His silver hair caught the light as he unfolded the second announcement. "What Dr. Johnson created did more than save my wife," he said. "It changed what this hospital, and perhaps transplant medicine itself, believes is possible." He turned toward Maya. "Today, St. Victoria Medical Center establishes the Maya Johnson Donor Heart Preservation Research Fund, dedicated to advancing donor heart viability technology and equitable transplant access." The applause returned, louder than before. A digital banner lit behind the stage with Maya's name in blue and silver across the hospital crest. For a woman who had once watched her mother lose life-saving minutes because the system moved too slowly for people without money, the moment carried a gravity words could barely hold. In the front row, Angela Johnson pressed trembling fingers to her mouth. She had dressed carefully for today in a soft cream blouse and navy coat, her short, silver-streaked curls neatly shaped, her aging heart monitor long gone. In the weeks since Eleanor Bennett's surgery, Angela had been transferred into St. Victoria's Lifetime Premium Cardiac Care Program, fully funded under the new donor access initiative Maya herself had inspired. Her color had returned, so had her smile. Beside her sat Eleanor Bennett, still recovering but radiant in the kind way staff had always remembered her. She reached across and squeezed Angela's hand, two women from entirely different worlds now connected by the same heartbeat. In the months that followed the announcement, the changes inside St. Victoria spread beyond headlines. Dr. Ethan Brooks became Maya's formal long-term research collaborator. At 29, Ethan had grown from the uncertain resident she once guided in trauma intake into a confident transplant systems specialist. His thoughtful hazel eyes still carried the same quiet loyalty, but now his role was official: data modeling, cold storage analytics, and national transplant rollout simulation for the Johnson 18-minute protocol. The partnership suited them. Maya built the vision. Ethan fortified the proof. Together, they began preparing papers that would carry the protocol far beyond Boston. Angela, meanwhile, entered a new chapter of her own. Under Eleanor Bennett's quiet sponsorship and the hospital's new outreach funding, she helped launch a free cardiac recovery and education program for working-class women, many of whom had spent years ignoring symptoms because of cost, childcare, or fear. Angela's gift had never been medicine itself, it was trust. Women listened to her because she spoke like someone who had once been exactly where they were. No white coat, no prestige, only truth. And because Maya had never forgotten what it meant to be the only black woman in rooms designed to doubt her, she launched one more initiative: the Johnson Mentorship Pathway, a program built for young black female physicians, first-generation medical students, and scholarship residents from low-income families. It paired them with mentors, funded simulation hours, and provided protected research access without departmental gatekeeping. The first orientation session filled within 48 hours. By early May, St. Victoria unveiled the final transformation. The old transplant operating suite, once efficient but dated, had been completely renovated into a state-of-the-art cardiac innovation theater. Glass walls, integrated perfusion AI displays, thermal preservation analytics built directly into the donor intake line. At the center of the entrance, etched into brushed steel, the Johnson Transplant Innovation Suite. The final scene unfolded there. Maya stood beneath the soft white surgical lights, now no longer alone. Around her, a new generation of residents gathered in navy scrubs, their faces bright with focus and possibility. Some were international scholars. Some came from Boston public schools. Two young black women from her mentorship pathway stood closest to the main display, already debating perfusion interval improvements with the kind of confidence Maya had once been denied. On the central monitor, the Johnson 18-minute protocol pulsed through a live simulation model. Thermal compensation, pre-bypass stabilization, extended viability sequence. Ethan adjusted the timing curves from the side station while smiling toward Maya. This version may push it to 19. Maya almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she looked toward the ECG monitor mounted near the far surgical wall. A strong, steady heartbeat echoed through the room from the training simulation. The sound filled the suite. Not just survival, legacy. Because what Maya Johnson had won back was never only her reputation. It was time. Time for the patient in the ambulance. Time for the mother waiting in the dark. Time for the resident no one expected. Time for the future. And as spring sunlight poured through the glass walls of the new operating suite, illuminating the faces of young surgeons learning from the protocol she built out of pain, memory, and impossible precision, Maya understood what the heartbeat truly meant. Not proof, not revenge, a beginning. The lesson at the end of Maya Johnson's story is something many of us face in everyday life. Sometimes the world judges people before it truly sees their work, their pain, or the journey that shaped them. In real life, we may not stand in an operating room, but we all meet moments where truth, patience, and quiet excellence matter more than pride, status, or unfair opinions. This story reminds us that real character is revealed under pressure. And the people others underestimate are often the ones carrying the answers everyone needs. A gentle lesson for daily life is this: never let someone else's fear, bias, or power make you forget why you started. Whether in work, family, school, or relationships, stay faithful to your purpose. Keep building your skills and let your actions speak when words fail. At the same time, we should learn to treat people with fairness and dignity, because today's overlooked person may become tomorrow's greatest blessing. This is also a reminder that systems, workplaces, and communities become stronger when they reward truth, discipline, and compassion instead of favoritism or prejudice. We should all reflect on how quickly we judge others by background, appearance, race, or status, and choose to become people who open doors instead of closing them. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment about the moment that moved you most, and let us know where you are watching from. If you believe truth, faith, and perseverance can still change lives, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more powerful stories. May God bless every person watching, protect your family, strengthen your heart in difficult seasons, and give you the courage to keep going when life feels unfair. If you believe that what is meant for you cannot be stolen when God is guiding your path, type Amen in the comments and let this story be a blessing to someone else today.